So, where to start? We were pushing out this one big bottom. It's a huge hillside running with a bunch of different other properties. There is our property, my family property, that has a big, about 20-acre field, wraps around a big river, and there's about 15 to 20 acres of just pure CRP ground. Super tall stuff. There was no lanes mowed or anything like that, so access at that point was really hard, and determining how to get in there was a whole another nightmare to when it was time to bow hunt for this year. But my brother was walking through this CRP ground, and he had picked up this monster, jumped up. Never got a shot at him. All he had was just a view of the backside of the deer. He had ran, jumped the river, and jumped into private property. So that was really the first time that anybody has known about this deer. I never bow hunted it until coming into this season and after that, but definitely a spot that will take some attention to next year. So after that, it was kind of game on with what we were going to do coming into the 2023-2024 bow season. And this property is a very hard one to figure out how you're going to bow hunt. You have some properties that are very easy in terms of access and food and water, and where people and houses and everything else are. But this one was a very challenging one. Really, it's not that far from a road, but the road is visible. The road can really look over a heavy part of this bottom. So these deer, for the most part, they come out to eat, or if they're just roaming, they can really be seen from the road. But after a while, obviously, we all know how they get used to everything. So walking this property, I only did a little bit during that year. Like I said, it was toward the end of gun season, and I had already killed my buck at this point. So this was kind of just a figuring out what's there, trying to figure out what's going on, see what deer are back there in lines, and try to get a hold of this deer to see what he actually looked like for this deer season. So in terms of property and how we were going to put up trail cameras to be able to get on these deer, kind of had to take a different approach. There, like I said, there is a lot of private property to the other side of this big, massive bottom. So with walking this property, it seemed apparent that the only way that we were going to be able to really even see a deer is if we were to go off the river. Like I said, they're really out in the open if they were to go out in the fields to eat, and if they were, it was just too close to getting into houses. You know, you have this big river bottom that wraps around in this major river. When we were trying to figure out where to put cameras, like I said, you have to the north, there's this big road, and to the right, about to the east, there is another road that kind of comes up a hillside. You really can't see down in this bottom, but there are a bunch of houses there. And to the west, you have this hayfield that kind of comes back into a funnel, almost a natural funnel. And personally for me, I love funnels. I think they're the easiest way to try to be able to get on deer, and you have cover on both sides, and it's just a really nice way to where they're coming into like a hardwood, or they're going into a bedding area or something like that. It's a really good place that you can basically count on them coming out in the open. So with putting up cameras, I really focused on that river and where they were going to come from to get into the food source, because it was so open. There's not a lot of trees there. There's just more trees along the river, and then there's that big open CRP ground going into the west with that hayfield going back into where the main part of the woods is at. So I started with the river, and the very first night I put a camera up, it was freezing cold out, and he showed up, and it was a beautiful picture of him. And that was really toward the end where I was like, all right, you know, this is a very serious deer. And like I will, you know, go on to show you a little bit later, and you might be able to see, is that this deer was not big. He was not an old deer. He did not have signs of an old deer. He had these pretty white capes, minimal scarring, teeth had little to no wear, even his molars, pretty white. And he's just in his rack from this year watching him. I mean, this last year into this year, it was very thin. The differences of mass that he grew on his beams was a lot more this year than it was last year. So that was another really good tell that this deer obviously was not that old of a deer. So going into this a little bit later at this point, you know, we're in January or so, and it's coming to the end of gun season, going into bow, that late bow, finishing out. And obviously I'm not hunting, nobody else is hunting. This is just for, you know, gathering up information, trying to figure out the most we could about this deer, because obviously with him being so big, he's going to be a hard one to get. after I got that first picture, I was getting a lot of good pictures of bucks, other bucks, nice deer that, maybe weren't obviously this caliber, but very nice deer to know that there is a lot of signs of deer back there, and there is big deer back there, and I needed to pay attention to it next year. So he had come up and he hit this one scrape, and this really showed me how big this deer was right toward the end. It was right before I took cameras down. And it was just like I was telling you about, it's this pencil thin rack. I mean, on his beams, he had no mass to him at all. I mean, he still had all these points. He was a big 16 point. And I mean, it really wasn't anything, substantial. He was a very big deer, but not like how he had grown into this. And that's another reason to tell these deer that, is that you don't know, if you don't know for 100% if the deer is a young deer or an older deer, when they jump up in mass on those beams in just that year, you can really tell that he's still in a good growing stage. So coming into the 2023-2024 season, I was behind, to say the least. Putting these cameras up, I had 3 cameras down on the bottom, and the very first night I put this camera up, it was maybe 100 yards from the other places I had gotten the pictures of him. But this was kind of more toward down this bottom. There's not much of woods, like I had said, but there is this one point to where this woods kind of comes out, this little patch of woods that runs along the river kind of comes out to a point that meets into where the CRP is. But the problem with hunting there is that it was very exposed. These trees had no limbs, there was no cover. You'd be a sore thumb sitting up there. But I did put a camera up there because I figured if he was doing what he did from last year, he was going to run that east and go to the west, back toward the bedding areas, and he'd always show up at about 9 o'clock at night heading toward the west. But I never get him back on camera coming back east. So that basically told me that the deer was staying in there overnight, and he was coming back in the mornings. I mean, he was staying in there during the day, coming back in the mornings to go stay in this hardwood, and that was where he was going through most of his day. After we got that very first picture of him, that night I had set out the cameras, just like we did last year. I had really started to get a bunch more this year. He always ran in a bachelor group with at least 4 or 5 other bucks, and he'd always come in again from the east working to the west. This time he was not as particular on the times he was showing up. He was showing up in broad daylight. So this had also told me that he was running still in these bachelor groups, and it was going to be very hard to get him by himself. And there's a bunch of deer back there that are nice deer. And getting back in there, like I had said, with the access is very, very hard. You have to walk through this open CRP ground. The chances of bumping a deer out, you're going to at least bump one. And you're praying in your head that it's not him. There's no other way to do it without getting onto the property lines, and you don't want to be doing that with trespassing. So after I had gotten those pictures of him, I had went out the next weekend, put up a stand, and I was very, very careful about it. Was in and out of there, sent it up really good. Did it during about noon. It was not anything to where I thought deer would be up. Deer, at that point, they were showing up toward, evening time where they were going to eat out in the alfalfa field or going back toward the cornfield, because there was corn on in that big field, right butting up to the CRP ground I was hunting. After I set the stand up, I got crazy with work, and I have a very, very limited amount of time to hunt this deer. I only had the weekends to be able to do it, and it was usually only a Friday and Saturday. So coming into the bow season part of things, our season came in September 30th. I had missed the opening weekend, and I waited a little bit because, like I said, it was a very, very hot October. We didn't even get any type of coldness until we got into late October, into that early pre-rut stage in November 5th to about November 11th. So I went in there October 5th, the morning of, working my way back through the CRP ground, got into the stand, got halfway up the stand, and as soon as I did, the stand had made a sound to where the metal had cracked just a little bit, and I heard the corn start moving behind me, and I just kind of sat there for a second, and I was praying that it wasn't him, and whatever deer was out there, he'd just sit there. If I stayed still long enough, he'd just move off because he couldn't see me. Well, boy, was I wrong. I took one more step about 10 minutes later after that, and as soon as I did, it cracked again, and I just hurried up and climbed to the top of it. My bow was still on my back, and I literally looked to my right. It was coming into daylight. That's why I hurried up and just made a decision to get up into the stand, and he was standing 25 yards broadside, and then as soon as I had tried to reach for my bow, he had already ran off and crossed into the river. So after that, the rest of October, I never got a picture of him at all. And I was beating myself up. I was like, what could I have done differently? How could I have done this differently? I must be the worst hunter out there. So I had this other property that my family owns that's about 1.5 miles south of this place, and I never really hunted it because of the reason that there's no water source and there is houses just a little bit to the north of the woods. And like I said, this woods is incredibly small. I don't even know if it's 5 acres big. So, and it's very thin. The front part of the woods is very open. There's only that one spot right in there, but through the back of it gets a little bit thicker, but those houses are right there. So I really never figured in the world he would ever show up there. But I put cameras up there just to be safe. You know, I was like, I gotta be able to at least try to find this deer. Yeah, I had nothing on him, and you know, I'm bummed out, and we're getting to this point to where actually now the cold snap's coming in. So the very first night I put a camera up, I was walking through this woods and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. It was on a rainy day, and I really didn't want to go too deep into it with the, you know, with the thinking that he was in there, and if I bump him out again, then I'm really done for. It was noon. I went up there. I normally always try to go in during the middle of the day. I don't ever try, and especially if it's a nice day out like that day was, it was very warm. I don't try to go in there either early morning or early in the evening. It's best to go in noon, try to get them when they're bedded down, and just be very, very quiet. Scent up good, used all my hunting clothes. And I was walking the south side of this woods, and I had noticed on the ground that there was this massive scrape. And it was so dominant that you could see where he would be putting his antlers, his G1s and G2s right in the ground and just scraping them as he was making this dominant scrape. So I decided to move my trail camera over there, and I went back, and that very next night I got a notification on it, and it was this massive 9-point. Probably one of the biggest 9 points I've seen, and will definitely be the deer that I will be going after next year. So at this point, I haven't got any pictures of this buck all through the rest of October after bumping him up, and I'm basically kind of pushing him off to the afterburner, which is horrible, but just hoping he can make it through another season, go back in there if I left it alone long enough. So my plan was now that I was going to go back after this 9, and that was going to be my new main focus. So after getting pictures of this buck, this is, I think I had got my very first picture of him October 30th is when I had moved cameras around and got the very first picture. Coming into November, obviously we're getting into that really good week, that 5th to the 11th, that time frame to where, I mean, it's just the perfect deer hunting. Going into the first weekend of November, the 3rd and 4th, I had went out both morning and night, and I had seen, again, those small bucks, nothing major, and it was nothing to where my hopes were high. I only saw very minimal deer action, and I had figured that maybe I just got a picture of this deer roaming through rut and being a drifter buck. Maybe he's not even there. So after that, I had to go back to work, and I kept getting pictures of this deer throughout the week. Almost every single night I get a picture of him, and he was again coming from the same exact direction this buck was, east, to working his way west. But where he was going, I couldn't tell if he was going back and kicking toward that south way, going back and trying to get across to that huge bottom, or if he was going back to the same bottom that this big buck had come from, which that is what I had figured he was doing, because that other way was a very, very long walk for him. That other one, he could have been back to thick woods where we've seen a lot of does come out of, and he would have been a lot safer back that way. There's not anybody that hunts over there. So going into the next weekend in November, the 10th and the 11th, I went out the 10th with my other buddy, and we were sitting there in a ground blind, and we had gotten in that day. It was super, super quiet. It was rainy out through that whole entire day, so the leaves were wet. We got in there very, very, very silently. Got sat down, and moving through the night, it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock. It had really started to get nasty out, and at that point we were kind of heads down, no movement, and it had actually started letting up toward that 5 p.m. range, and we had a doe come in from behind us, and she was making a little circle with her tail up, obviously an estrus, and that was what saved us that night. Without that, we would have really had a hard time. So while we were sitting there watching that doe, that's when everything just erupted. There was bucks moving in and out, coming from the cornfield, and coming from that other side to that west, coming in out of that. There's this big long fence row that connects to that bottom that they were running constantly. And we were sitting there, and about 20 minutes after that doe had moved in and moved back off, this little buck coming from behind us, and we were watching him. You know, he just came in so close that if we moved at all, we would have bumped him out of there. So we were really trying to watch him, and while I'm so focused on him, my other buddy had looked over toward the tree line to where that big long fence row is, and there's this buck on the outside. He couldn't really make out to what he was. He just saw him hitting a scrape, and this little buck's still right there. So we're not doing too much with moving. We're not trying to tell what kind of deer it is, because if you bump this buck out, it's game over for the rest of the night and probably the rest of the weekend. We let this little buck move off. This bigger one that we thought was bigger, he had moved off. Everything was gone, so I picked up my black racks and I started rattling. With this woods, again, with these smaller pieces of property, you gotta be very careful with how you wanna rattle. You don't wanna just get them racks together and smash them, because obviously if the deer is 50 yards away, he's gonna know something's up. But you also don't wanna do them quiet enough to the point to where something that might be 100 yards away is not gonna even be able to even hear you. So I was just sitting there kind of making a little bit of a sparring noise, and not even 2 minutes after I put him down, this deer had started moving in from the left. I really couldn't see him all that well. My buddy had a better view of him. He had first thought that he was a doe. So after he was moving through this thicker part of the woods, he'd come into this clearing to where I had a shooting lane that opened up. I actually had 2 of them to where I had cut some down when I put the blind up. This third one was kind of more of a last resort during gun. It wasn't really meant for bow. So this deer is moving in, and as soon as I turn around to actually get a look of him, I see that he is the deer that I've had been hunting all along. I have no pictures of, and at this point, my nerves are at an all-time high. I'm freaking out. He's coming in, he's not wanting to stop, and I'm trying to reposition my chair around, and I'm also hunting with a compound, so it makes things very difficult when you have 2 people in a blind, you have a chair, and you're trying to get into a draw while all not spooking the deer. This deer is moving in, and he's about 10 yards from the first shooting lane. I hurry up and draw back. As soon as I drew back, my peep sight was bent on my bow. I'm trying to whisper to my buddy to hurry up and flip it for me, and he can't really hear me because, again, I'm whispering. So by the time he does get to the peep sight and fixes it, he's already moved past my best lane. He gets into the second, I yell, he does not stop at all. He gets to the third one, that last resort lane, I screamed as loud as I could, and right when he stopped, that front shoulder blade and that front part went all behind a big walnut tree. And I'm sitting there, and the only shot I have is a gut shot. I'm sitting there, and he's kind of looking around. His ears are pinned back. You know, at this point, he really knows something's going on. And I'm just thinking in my head, you know, this is the second time I've messed everything up. This deer's going to be gone, and chances of me trying to get back on him again it's over. He sits there for some reason. He just didn't care. He put his ears back down, put his head back down, and kept on going the exact same way he started. After that, he had moved on, and I'm thinking that, you know, the only way I'm going to be able to kill this deer is if I can get to that other side of the woods, stay in the woods, and get up in a tree. So, with getting up, with knowing that I needed to get in a tree to be able to kill this deer, and not having the time nor having the opportunity to put a tree stand up in the amount of time to be able to still get on this deer during rut, I personally have never used a climber or never used a saddle stand, and I had a good buddy that has, Alex Lackner. So I had gotten hold of Alex earlier in the day of the 11th, and I had told him that if there's any opportunity that you have to be able to show me how to use one fast, or if you'd be willing to come out with me that night to be able to try to get on this deer, I'd really appreciate it. So at about 9-10 o'clock in the morning on the 11th, I went over to Alex's house. He was kind of showing me how to use this climber and everything this saddle stand, and he had just mentioned that he will end up going with me. So at this rate, we had none of this planned. I had no tree picked out that we were going to put this saddle on. I mean, this was a last minute everything. So, and at this rate, it's getting to about noon, about 1 o'clock, and everything is so fast paced that we're trying to figure out how we're going to be able to get back there and stand. It's not crazy long of a walk, so that definitely was in our favor. And I told him that, you know, this is a very, very big deer, but I don't, you know, have all that much information on him here. I had a bunch of pass with him back at this other place, and I bumped him out, and we needed to find a way to get up into the tree to be able to get after this guy. He had got his clothes, I went and got mine, we met at the field. At this rate, it's already about 2 o'clock, so we're really trying to rush, and it wasn't a very cold day, it wasn't a very warm day, but the problem was that we had a horrible wind. It was blowing right back to the west where I had pictures of him all along in this huge bottom where he stayed his entire life. So as we're moving back to this woods, you know, we're really trying to be careful. The leaves are crunchy. We're not trying to make a bunch of noise, but at the same time, we have no idea what tree we're going to put this saddle on. So we're trying to look for a tree. We're trying not to bump things out. We're moving along this tree line, trying to figure out where a little bit of a scrape line's at. That way, if he does try to come hit his scrape later that night, we were going to be in the opportunity to be able to have a shot on this deer. After we find this tree, he's starting to set up the climbers. He's starting to get these sticks on. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, if this buck wins us, we're done. I mean, he ain't gonna come over here tonight. That's even if he's not bedded in here already and we didn't bump him out. I took about 2 cans of Dopey and just soaked the bottom of the tree, soaked my boots, soaked everything I could possibly get on without obviously soaking my face. As he's setting up the sticks, you know, we're trying to hurry up and get up there. Our bows are still on the ground. My bow's still on the ground. You know, we had figured that we'd bring at least a little bit of camera gear. All he had was 2 GoPros. So he's getting up, he's starting to get the GoPro set up. I'm getting my stuff up, getting my bow up the tree. And he's getting halfway through everything. And I look out in the field, and at 3:44, broad daylight, this buck comes right out on us on a string. We're hurrying up, trying to get some stuff around. I had snuck a little video in with my phone real quick, and he's trying to hurry up and get video switched around. I'm trying to get my bow switched around. He's moving about 50 yards. He'd come out in this cornfield a little bit, but you could definitely tell he was very, very nervous. He did not like being out there in broad daylight, so he kind of wanted to stick back more toward that fence row. And the tree we had ended up deciding that we were going to hunt on that evening was still about 80 yards off that fence row. He had stick to the fence row. He was coming in, keep coming in on a string, really not wanting to stop. He come into that where that fence row meets into the woods. Alex had a better view of him the entire time. I could see a little bit of him as he was moving through. Alex watched him make about 2 different rubs. He moved on the backside of the woods over to the thicker area, and we had completely lost him. So obviously during this point, your nerves again are at an all-time high because you don't know if he's going to stay over there and bed over there for the rest of the night, or if he's going to end up eventually making his way back over. We're sitting there, we're having a bunch of different movement. We got does out in the cornfield behind us. You know, we have some other deer back in the thicker part of the woods to the north, making a bunch of noise and racket. And we're sitting there kind of figuring out, you know, do we grunt, do we not grunt, do we rattle, do we not rattle? Because this woods in the north is the only thick side of the woods. And it's very, very hard to see in there. I mean, you have no idea if the buck's 50 yards from you, if the buck's 10 yards from you. So rattling was kind of off the tables. We really thought that was too loud, too much stuff going on. He definitely knows something was up. So we were throwing out a couple little buck grunts because we obviously knew from the previous night that this deer was somewhat of a territorial deer. I barely rattled and he come in and was ready to fight right away. So while we're sitting there, I look out toward the south to where the other cornfield is of the property that I am hunting on, and I see him come out. Their farmers had taken off about 50 yards from the woods to where the corn had started just to open up the field, and he had come right out of the corn, standing right there, 10 yards in front of my blind that I was in the previous night in the perfect shooting lane. And I'm beating myself up, like, why did I move? This was dumb. You know, I should have been in the blind. I shouldn't have been over here. And as we're sitting there, my buddy, Alex, had tapped me on the side, and I saw this other deer making his way around the bend, which was, we had come later to figure out that it was the big 9. And they had kind of moved off toward the southwest part of the woods, and it was very hard to see them. But what we could do is we could hear them absolutely smashing one another. We could see their tails and butts moving back and forth, but we really couldn't get any of it on video, which was very, very sad. But after the fight was done, my buck had come into the woods. The other buck had veered around back toward heading north, and we kind of lost visual of him. This buck had come in at this rate is about 90 yards. We're looking at about 4:15 or so in the afternoon. And he had come in a little bit more, made a little rub, but you could tell he was exhausted. His tongue was hanging out. You know, he obviously had just gotten beaten. And he had come into this little part of this honeysuckle and just bedded down. Stuck his G2s, stuck his G1s right in the ground and went to sleep. So at this point, I had lost full visual of him. I couldn't really even see him after he had bedded down, but Alex kept saying, you know, I swear he's right there. There's no way he moved out of there without me not seeing him. And we're sitting there, time's going on, and I'm thinking in my head that we were going to watch this buck lay down at 100 yards, and we're going to have to sit here and watch him go to sleep and then bump him on the way out. You know, this is the worst way it could have went. And as we're sitting there, it's getting to that 4:30, 4:45 marker, and we're like, oh Lord, you know, please just get up on your feet or something. We're trying to figure out, again, do we rattle, do we not rattle, do we put out a doe bleat, do we put out a buck grunt? You know, at this point, he's already heard it, and he just got done fighting. Who knows if he still wants to fight? And Alex ended up hitting a little doe bleat with a little buck grunt followed right after it, and about 5 minutes later, he stood up, and right when he stood up, he was all angry again. Hair all fused right up like they normally do, thrashing his rack around in the weeds a little bit in the leaves, and he went up and made another rub. And as he's sitting there making that rub, we're kind of deciding, you know, is he going to head back north? Am I going to get a broadside shot, or what is going to do? I'm repositioning in the saddle. It's my first time being in it. I have no idea really how I want to shoot. and how I'm going to shoot. So I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. Alex is trying to get camera gear moved around because he came from that opposite side, like how he come into the woods. So he's trying to get everything flipped around. And as he was coming, this buck had made this rub, and he was coming back. He started heading north a little bit, and then all of a sudden he turned on a beeline right for us. And he was moving pretty quick. So he was about 50 yards or so. I decided to draw back. Right when I drew back, my Hoyt flip rest had made a little, I accidentally just barely touched it with my thumb, and it flipped down. And right when it did, it made a noise. His ears went up in the air, and it was back to being alert. At this point, I'm like, I'm gonna have to make a 50-yard shot. He's not even barely quartered enough for me to be able to sneak one in. It's gonna have to be a low brisket shot. Hopefully it shoots through that underside of that shoulder blade and gets him in the lungs and the heart. And he's still moving at this point, and I'm trying to decide where I'm gonna put the shot at on the deer. And he's about 35 yards. And I was like, if he stops, I'm gonna hit him low. If he barely turns that neck, maybe I can get it in above that shoulder blade. And he come into about 30 yards, and he stopped, and right when he stopped, I was just waiting for him, and he kind of turned that neck just a little bit to where it needed to be, and it let me float an arrow in right over the top of the shoulder blade. And he went about 5 yards. He sat there for a couple seconds, and he fell to the ground, started doing a shake, and that was the end of it.
That's huge.
And that was, the craziest thing ever. I probably had to sit up in the stand for about 30 minutes so I didn't fall out of the thing.
Dude, oh my god. Fucking god. It's a pig, dude. Oh shit. Holy fuck. Wow.
Count that as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18.
Oh my god.
So that's the end of this guy and the journey that I went on with. A lot of ups, a lot of downs, and a lot of moments that I never thought would have come back out into my favor. So we're gonna bring him out. We'll look at him a little bit here real quick. So true and true, he's a 19 point. So he's a true 19 point, and he's got like how we named him the Fang buck after Toby Hughes and kind of gave him that name, where he comes off his left G1. It's just really cool how he comes down with these little fangs. Started on his other side, he probably would have done the same thing. He didn't have this split brow last year, so that was really neat to see this year. That had come up. But what I was talking about, to reiterate the point of how I think he was a young deer, is that he masked up so much from last year. When you were watching him hitting these scrapes last year during late season, he was very, very thin on his beams. He really had no mass to him yet. He really had nothing down here. So to watch him mass up that fast and during all them velvet pictures, it was really, really cool to see what he would have done. Next year he's starting to maybe have some drop times coming off these beams on both sides, and where he comes down, if he would have clubbed out, or if he would have clawed out like he did on his other side, would have been pretty cool, neat to see. But definitely a beautiful buck, something that is going to be incredibly hard to beat for me, myself, and the opportunity to have on this deer was just insane. Beautiful deer.
Quit with the ums.
Quit with the ums.
Trust me, I'm bad at that too. Just try. Try your hardest.
And I went up there. It was about noon o'clock. It was about noon.
Noon o'clock.
Noon o'clock.